Hello, everyone, and I think it is so great that we met the other day, last Thursday, because now I feel that I'm recording this talking to some real people and not to a screen. So today I start with a short history of human rights, the first part of it, the classical tradition and modernity. And by looking into the history of human rights, we at the same time I think we're trying to present an idea of what counts as a just a peaceful society in different periods and ages, what it meant to be a person in those ages and societies. Because we can trace the history of what counts as the good and a peaceful society in the values, the ethics, and the justice of those societies, which are often reflected in their law. Now, if we divide history in the standard way between a pre-modern, a modern, and a late or post-modern period, we can say as a kind of title or summary of what I'm going to be talking to you about today and next week, that the pre-modern world had a conception of right, what it means to be or to act in a right way, to be a good person. This became individual rights, rights for individuals in modernity, and of course human rights in late modernity. Initially, in the pre-modern world, the right, what is the right way to act, was found in the cosmos, in the world. Then we moved to rights created by philosophers and jurists and revolutionaries and given to select groups of individuals, promoting sameness and a degree of equality. And of course, now we have rights that take up and protect interests and choices of groups and campaigns and ideologies which prioritize difference. So let me start. The first mention of the term human rights was in the 1920s. But of course, the intellectual pedigree goes far back. The human rights, what we call today human rights, both the legal textual side and the more movement political side, is a result of a combination of ideas, of traditions, and political events. If we look at ideas, the history of ideas, we can count classical natural law and modern natural rights, Jewish and Christian theology, the ideas of the Enlightenment and modern rationalism, today postmodern multiculturalism, and of course all these ideas in schools of ideas and philosophies have their own internal debates, conflicts, and they all have played a part. But then of course there is a political history of human rights, which would include, if we take account only of modernity, the French Revolution, the American world of independence, the Russian Revolution and its aftermath, of course the Nazi crimes and the universal revulsion they caused, and of course very many other less important historical events, because at the end a complex idea and a complex movement like human rights is the result, the coming together of various different streams and various different ideas and people and actions and events and revolutions, and to a certain extent something like that, when it appears as ready-made, is a contingent, the contingent result of all these different thoughts and ideas and events and people. Now, I will start examining some of these contributors in the Western tradition, starting with classical Greece. Now, why the Western tradition? It is clear that human rights, as it was first proclaimed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 1948, came from the Western tradition. Indeed, one of the main drafters of the Universal Declaration, John Humphreys, when asked later whether he was aware of the Asian, particularly the Chinese tradition of ethics and morality, he said, no, I did not go away and I did not study Confucius before writing the first draft of the Declaration. Of course, today, after the initial period of human rights legislation and standard setting and so on, of course, other traditions, the African tradition that is, of course, encapsulated in the African Declaration of Rights, which has substantive differences from the Universal Declaration. American traditions, Asian traditions have come onto the field, and of course they give today different interpretations, but also different directions to what human rights ought to be. But the initial move was Western, and that initial move, the Western conception of human rights, of course, was inaugurated in classical Greece. Now, in the pre-classical world, before the 5th century in Athens, the rulers, the ruling class were priests and, of course, ideas and principles and values of the ancestors. When the idea of nature was invented by classical philosophers, it allowed people like Socrates or Aristotle or Plato, later the Sophists and the Stoics, to examine rationally what was happening in the world according to the nature of the entities, of the relations, of the cities. So the idea of nature was a critical standard. It was not just about something that happens out there. It was something, it was an idea, a concept that had revolutionary possibility because it could be used to criticize and even to unseat the authority of priests, of religion, and the ancestral principle. Now, of course, for nature to be such an important idea, such an important revolutionary and philosophical concept, you had to be in what we can call a natural cosmology, an idea about how the world exists, what is the world, how it operates. And in that idea, the natural cosmology, the natural cosmos, the natural world, every animate and inanimate being has a unique nature that determines its purpose, its end, its telos, and links that particular entity with all others. So the cosmos and everything that exists in it is united as an organic whole. Beings, gods, trees, stones, water, and everything else are related like limbs in an organically structured whole. Now, what is the nature of every being, the nature and the purpose in its existence? It is to become the perfect specimen of its kind. That is what the nature and the purpose of each one of the beings is. The purpose of the vine is to produce the sweetest wine, of the shoemaker to make the best sandals, the best shoes, I forget the names of the famous shoe brands today. The soldier has as its purpose to become the bravest warrior. And not only animate beings and humans. Aristotle argued that stones fall if released because everything aims to move to the center of the earth. And the role of the philosopher of Aristotle is to teach people how they can become virtuous. In other words, how they can move, they can travel from the state they're in towards their purpose, towards fulfilling their own nature, which of course is unique for each particular species and indeed for each singular individual. So therefore, nature is not the natural world, an objective part of the world out there, against which we, the subject, the subjective world, is taking an attitude of exploitation, of use, and so on. No, it is a standard of judgment, which helps to determine whether a particular person or a particular action is right, is just, according to the nature of the person or the nature of the participants. Now, there are some important consequences of this type of cosmology, of this purposeful world, and of these beings, the animate beings, humans, whose nature determines how they ought to act in life. The first is that there is no great distinction between morality and legality. Every person, every human is embedded, exists and lives in strong relations, family, kinship, community ties, and precisely those community ties, those relations create the duties of each person. The idea of the individual, of the subject with rights does not exist. The key resource of ethics and of morality is not rights, but it is duties. Those duties that emerge, that follow on from, that are the result of those strong relations that create the person we're discussing. So someone is the sum total of all these relations, of all these duties, of this environment in which she lives and which creates her place in the world. And if we turn to law and judges, the right answer to a moral dilemma that a citizen faces, or a legal dilemma that a judge has to resolve, a conflict that leads to the law, is resolved by the judge observing the relationship that has been disturbed by the conflict, and then taking measures, ordering remedies which will put back that relationship in its natural balance, in its natural state of being. So that is the kind of a very broad description of the natural cosmology and the effects that it has on the way that people and relations and the key relationship between people and the outside world is constructed. A cosmology, a way of being, which of course is totally alien to the world we know and we live and love today. Now, the idea of natural law, we talked about nature, about the nature of beings, the nature of everything. But the idea of natural law was developed a little later in the 4th, 3rd century BC by the school of Stoics, who referred to regularities, patterns, repeated patterns in the world, both the social, the human, and the natural world, a distinction which, as I said, did not exist at the time. And they believed that if you contemplate, if you reflect on what exists around you, then you can find these regularities, these patterns, this repetition, which allows you, to come up with laws, with natural laws. Indeed, you say that one of the early definitions of philosophy was a certain curiosity about the world, that the philosopher wakes up, or indeed any one of us, any citizen, wakes up one morning and says, why is the world the way it is, both in its general characteristics, but also in its more specific relations between people, animals, gods, and so on. So, unlike our own world today, when we speak about natural law in the classical and indeed post-classical tradition, it is not about the laws of nature that the term we use today, the law of gravity, or the laws of the movement of the stars. It is about those as well as about norms of human behavior that today we would call them ethics and law. They are together. To give you an example, some of you will know the classical tragedy of Antigone, perhaps the best known and most commented upon work of classical literature. And Antigone was a princess who buried her brother against the orders of the king. The king had ordered that Antigone's brother should stay unburied and his flesh should be eaten by the animals out in the wild as punishment because he had attacked the city. Now Antigone disobeys the god and became, in a sense, the first, I suppose, heroine or princess or goddess of resistance. I mean, there have been hundreds of versions of Antigone all over the world and over the years, particularly in situations where people, poets, playwrights felt that they had to repeat and transfer the idea of resistance from the classical text by Sophocles to their contemporary situation. So Antigone buries her brother, and as a result she's condemned to die by the king for two reasons. One, you could call it as an objective reason. In the theory of life and death of the period, this is the 5th century BC, the dead must be buried because this is the only way they can travel from the world of the living to the underworld. It is absolutely necessary. If that does not happen, they remain living dead. But then there was also what we would call today a subjective factor, a moral sense that Antigone, out of her love for her brother, she felt obliged to do it. And that was also a natural duty. So we had a part of the natural law which described how things are done, and the part of natural law which prescribed, told Antigone what she had to do. Now, I said that Stoic philosophers turned this combination of the natures of the different beings into a concept of natural law, a kind of universal legality that unites everything. And they argued that since all humans share the ability to reason, then we could say that judgments about moral issues have a rational foundation. And that rational foundation can be shared. All rational people should know how to act in a correct way because they have an insight, they have an access to the way in which natural law works. And of course, there we find the beginning of the idea of a rational foundation of morality, which of course becomes absolutely central in modernity, particularly in the work of Immanuel Kant and the successors of Kant, the Neo-Kantians, and that idea of a rational morality, of a rational foundation of what is the correct thing to do, is of course one of the key philosophical traditions that eventually found its way into natural rights and human rights, of course. Now, the Greek Stoics were not particularly interested in affairs of state. Some of them were slaves, actually. What they cared for was contemplation, reflection, to be left alone, forget about the polis, the state, the city-state, and those matters, and try to work out how the world works. When that tradition was transferred from Athens to Rome. Roman Stoics, important Roman Stoics, like Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Cicero, unlike the Greek Stoics, who, as I said, were slaves, some of them, they didn't particularly care about the state. The Romans were emperors, were lawyers, were generals, military men, were men of affairs. And of course, these were the people who helped to build the empire. Here, the Stoic idea, a philosophical idea of natural law, became extremely useful. Because when you build an empire which is going to include in it different religions and languages and customs and moralities and nations and so on, and each one of those groups had their own law, their own ethics, their own morality, if you can claim that there is a natural law, an eternal and immutable law, as Cicero put it, which unites the whole cosmos, the whole world, the mundus, then of course that can help you overcome the different laws and customs of the regions and the nations of the empire. And this is exactly what the Romans did. And Cicero was a key person there because he claimed that the law of the nations, the jus gentium, as this law that the Romans imposed upon the whole of the empire, was indeed natural law. So although it was legislated in Rome, in reality it was the legalization of a much higher law that united the world. And here you see a kind of very interesting juxtaposition between the local and the imperial, the polis, the city, the state that legislates a law and then claims that actually it is or should become universal. And you can see already here some of the key debates around human rights as to whether, for example, human rights are just Western, not just in terms of their provenance, their history, but also in terms of their values, that there is something Western in human rights, but because the new Rome, let's say, the West, that has legislated those human rights, has the power, it can claim for it universal moral value now, not just the power and the force of a very powerful state or a coalition of states which imposes its will, but universal moral value, and therefore by accepting human rights, the subjects of the empire, they accept, however, or they conform with universal moral law. Now, the next great step in this story from Greece to Rome comes, of course, with the most important, I think, cultural transformation, sea change, huge sea change in the Western world and Europe, and that is Christianization, Christianity. Important changes, huge changes take place both in the organization of the empire and later the states, in the organization of the relations between people and power. Let me very briefly address some of them. In classical philosophy, in the Greek and the Roman world is infinite. The cosmos is everything. While the gods, the 12 gods of the Athenians or of the Romans, were in reality like humans. They were humans with exaggerated characteristics. They were like supermen and superwomen. So the world is everything. Gods are just, sort of a small group of characters that, in a sense, represent and take to the extreme characteristics that humans have. humans have. Now, in Jewish and Christian theology, God is the omnipotent creator of the universe. The world is created, is a creation, therefore very limited. And secondly, God is a legislator, a very severe legislator, and his legislation appears initially as a set of commandments, and of course later as commandments that are legislated by the church. So nature, as a result of this change, nature is created by God. God creates the world, creates man and woman. So nature no longer has any purpose, any telos, any way through which nature somehow prescribes what people should do. And nature starts moving towards the modern situation in which nature is inanimate, it is out there, it is a natural world. The subject, humanity, stands against nature and can use or exploit nature, which is now no longer part of the concatenation of everything that exists, but an inanimate and threatening world out there. So natural law loses that flexibility of the classical tradition and becomes definite, certain, simple. It is formulated by God, it is formulated by the church. And it acquires another characteristic that did not exist earlier. It becomes a higher law. It is a higher law, and a higher law that contains a small number of abstract prohibitions, commandments, values. But it is higher than the law of the empire, the law of the state. It is superior to state law, and if there is conflict between the law of the earthly kings and that of the celestial king, then the faithful citizens are entitled actually to break the law of the king. So that is a very important weapon in the hands of the church in order to challenge secular authorities for supremacy. Once, however, the Roman Empire became Christian, and we had the development of the Holy Roman Empire in the West and of the Holy Eastern Empire of Byzantium in the East, at that point the church starts somehow dismissing the importance of natural law because it does not want its authority to be challenged. Again, you see here some of the human rights implications of those ideas. The natural law that is now God-given is higher than the law of the state. A kind of hierarchy is being created, albeit at that point still a spiritual hierarchy between kingly decrees and laws and that higher law that is God-given. And at the same time, the idea of equality enters the historical scene, becomes part of culture. Characteristic is, of course, St. Paul's statement that in the eyes of Christ, there is no Greek or Jew, there is no man or woman, there is no freeman or slave. However, this is not a political or social equality, it's just spiritual equality. Slavery, that was, of course, the characteristic of the whole pre-modern world, either survives intact or has been changed from slavery into bondage of serfs, in the earth, in the areas in which they were born, and therefore the idea of freedom or of equality not just in the plan for salvation of Jesus does no longer, it has not yet been introduced. Indeed, the next great mutation in the brief history I'm telling you, from natural law to natural light, had to wait to the 14th century, when two Franciscan monks, Duns Scotus, or Duns from Scotland, and William of Ockham, known as the Nominalists, the Nominalist philosophical tradition, pushed Christianity, Christian theology at that point, in a number of extremely important ways that paved the way for the creation of individual rights later. Now, the Nominalists abandoned the classical belief that the rationality of the world, that natural law that exists in the world is still there, and argued that the fundamental entity of the creation is the individual, not groups or communities. The supreme expression of creation is individuality, as evidenced both in the creation of Adam and Eve by God, but also in the historical incarnation of Christ. Christ became an individual. The individual is the center of the creation. Relations between individuals, on the other hand, relations which were, as I said earlier, organic, that they were part of who the person was. Now, in this new theology, relations amongst individuals are external, are transient. A collectivity, a group, a society is nothing more than the sum total of individuals. They have nothing, there are no permanent or structural relations or characteristics that bring groups of people together. Natural law, on the other hand, has now been imposed by God. It is just God's will. And of course, because it is God's will and because God is omnipotent, He can change it radically any way He wishes. And because we cannot partake, we cannot share God's reason, we have to accept, for example, that God can dictate and determine that 2 + 2 equals 5. Or René Descartes, the great philosopher, French philosopher of modernity, who was also a major nominalist, argued that God could make adultery not a sin but a virtue, and various other things. That, in other words, whatever we consider as morally right, it is so, and indeed as empirically true. They're both so, they're both right and true because God has ordained so and God can change it. Again, you see this radicalization of the idea of a all-powerful, omnipotent God that can change the world whatever way He wishes. Now, why these people are called nominalists? Because following from that philosophical approach, the emphasis on the individual entity, the importance of an omnipotent creator and legislator, the inability of reason to understand why the world is as it is, and the necessity that reason accepts God's will, all these things lead to the conclusion that abstract ideas and concepts such as law, justice, the city, love, all these abstract ideas that you cannot pinpoint them in the world, and say this is justice. All these do not represent real entities. They have existence, they have come to life not because They are there as individual entities created by the God, but they're there because we have given them a name. And that is where nominalism comes from. All abstract entities, all entities that do not have a reference, a real thing, empirically observable in the world, exist only because we have given them a name, and then of course we can change them and create new ones. So the city, the term city, kivitas, polis in Greek, refers to the sum total of individual citizens that exist and live in a particular locality, and it is not a series, an ensemble, a group of activities, of aims, of relations, of purposes. And the same with law or with justice. The law is nothing more than the sum total of first godly laws and then laws of the king, of the city you live, and so on and so forth. Of course, you may remember now why Mrs. Thatcher said that society does not exist. What exists is individuals and families. This is a key, a typical nominalist position. Social relations are artificial. They are very much on the surface. There is nothing deeper that connects people together in groups and so on. Now, if we turn to human rights, we know that there is a major controversy, an argument, a debate between those who believe that human rights are universal and those who believe that rights and human rights come out and should come out of communities. Some people call them the relativists. They deny the universality of human rights, but of course it is not that they deny human rights altogether. They just say that community and relations within particular places are the basis and the foundation of any kind of ethics and morality, and therefore the law also and human rights as legal rights should express that kind of communal ethos. Now those communitarians or relativists as they are called, I think look like and argue like classical Greek philosophers. They believe that the code of ethics emerges organically in a society and community and can only function, can only be efficient if it accords, if it matches the values of a particular society. And to that extent, external enforcement trying to import or to impose ethics, values, or rights, or human rights upon a community is both wrong, but also it is ineffective. It's not going to work if people do not accept, in terms of their values, of their principles, of the way they live, those kinds of externally imposed ideas. Universalists, on the other hand, are clearly nominalists. They follow from the nominalist tradition. Universal laws and values both can and must be imposed externally in resisting societies. As long as social relations are superficial, artificial, even a reluctant society, a society that initially does not accept those rights, will eventually discipline and accept the universal code. And you could say that, in a sense, some of the great wars of the recent years, certainly the wars initially in Kosovo, later in Afghanistan, in Iraq, now in Syria, when they claim to have as part of their rationale the imposition of democracy and human rights, they follow that nominalist tradition, that societies can be redesigned. Regime change, as you remember, but it's not just about the regime, it's not just about the the rulers, the government, the dictator, whatever. It is about a redesignation, a refoundation of some of the key values and principles on which a society is founded. I will stop here. We will take some of these decisions further, but at the first part of our session next Thursday, I will show the radical change from those ideas, the radical revolutionary alteration of some of these ideas that I described today in early modernity, in the great philosophers and the great revolutions. How we moved, in other words, from a theory and a practice of morality and politics and law based on a conception of what is the right, the good for a society and a person, to be discovered in nature or later in God's will and the revelation and so on, to rights that exist for individuals, are given and belong to individuals, and a real reorganization of the whole world based upon this change from what is right to rights for individuals. I'll see you later. Thank you.